Hi, everyone. Welcome back. It's 4:45, and we are getting ready to roll with our next panel for the Words and Music Festival, sponsored, of course, by One Book, One New Orleans, which makes our city more literate, one book at a time. So, this panel is the brainchild of Annell López. Annell is a local writer. She is a Dominican immigrant. Her work has appeared or is forthcoming in Michigan Quarterly Review, Hobart, New Orleans Review, and elsewhere. She's the assistant poetry editor for the Night Heron Barks and the assistant fiction editor at the New Orleans Review. You can follow her at Annell the Book Babe on Instagram. Y señor y señora López, sé que estás mirando. Y ya sabe que tu hija es estupenda y muy prontito todo el mundo saber también. Annell López, y'all.
Thank you, Megan. That was such a beautiful introduction. Really kind of you to say that in Spanish. Hi, everyone. My name is Annell. I am so excited for this panel. So I read all three of the books of the authors that we're going to talk about today, and they were just fantastic. So I'm really excited to have them come out and talk to us. So we're going to get started. I'm going to introduce them one at a time, and then we'll all be together and we'll talk about home and haunting, which is the theme for today. But let's bring out Margaret Wilkerson Sexton. Before she comes out, I'll tell you a little. Oh, there she is. Well, Margaret is the author of The Revisioners, which I have right here. She's also the author of A Kind of Freedom. Margaret is born and raised in New Orleans. She studied creative writing at Dartmouth College and law at UC Berkeley. Her debut novel, A Kind of Freedom, was longlisted for the National Book Award and the Northern California Book Award as well. And it won the Crooks Corner Book Prize. She was the recipient of the first novelist award from the Black Caucus of the American Library Association. And she lives in the Bay Area with her family. Hey, Margaret, how are you?
Hi, good to be here.
So good to see you. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the other two writers. We have quite a panel today. So the next person is Michael Zapata. Michael Zapata is the founding editor of Make Literary Magazine. He is the recipient of an Illinois Arts Council Award for Fiction, the City of Chicago DCASE Individual Artist Program Award, and a Pushcart nomination. As an educator, he taught literature and writing in high school, servicing dropout students. He is a graduate of the University of Iowa and has lived in New Orleans. Welcome, Michael. How are you?
Thank you. Welcome.
The Lost Book of Dana Moreau. Also, I have a very special connection to this book, and I'll talk about it when we get started. And last but not least, we have Maisy Card, author of These Ghosts Are Family. Welcome, Maisy. Maisy holds an MFA in fiction from Brooklyn College. She is a librarian. Her nonfiction has appeared in Lenny Letter and School Library Journal. Her short fiction has been published by Agni, Sycamore Review, Liars League, NYC, and Ampersand Review. Maisy was born in St. Catherine, Jamaica, but was raised in Queens, New York. She earned an MLIS from Rutgers University and a BA in English and American Studies from Wesleyan University, and this is her first novel. And big congratulations to Maisy, who was nominated for the Center for Fiction debut novel. I think that's the word.
Thank you.
Congratulations on an order. Thank you guys for doing this and for joining us. So we titled the panel Home and Haunting. And one of the reasons why we did that was because all of your novels basically talk about, I don't want to say the word ghosts, but we definitely touch upon ancestry and just the way that ancestry is a hard thing to let go of. And it's a thing that basically stays with you and follows people. So I wanted to talk to you guys about ancestry in general. And I wanted to get started with how connected personally to your own ancestry are you? What have you discovered as an adult? What about your ancestry motivates you? What do you love? Any of you can get started.
I can start. So I have the ancestors that
that I actually had relationships with, like my grandparents who have passed, but I grew up with them. And I feel like especially with my first book, my grandmother who had passed and who basically raised me, she was the guiding image in my mind for my protagonist. And although the protagonist in A Kind of Freedom, the storyline and the fact situation differed drastically from what ended up happening with the protagonist versus my grandmother. It was like the spirit of the character was guiding me. I was inhabiting the spirit of my grandmother was guiding me as I was inhabiting my character's voice, and it helped me like sustain that voice throughout the novel. And of course, The Revisioners is really about the power of ancestry and the power of intergenerational wisdom and strength. And I wrote that book because I really hope that there are ancestors that are still present in our lives right now that are giving us strength, giving us wisdom, giving us power. And in that book, it was like I could create a world where that was the case, and it helped to buttress my own belief in that. And it's funny because when I was writing the main character, Josephine's section, I wasn't aware of certain facts about my family that I became aware of later. So like the main character, Josephine, owned a farm, and she was a public speaker, and she was, really active in her church and ahead of her time. And she just had this really sturdy spirit about her. And I learned that my great grandmother, Margaret, was very similar. And I've never met her, but, we have the same name, and she raised my father. And after I wrote the book, I started hearing more stories about her. And it's interesting. A lot of the aspects of my character that had just come to me were very similar to my great grandmother's actual personality and actual character traits. So that was interesting.
That's great. I would say that reading Josephine, which has her own sections in your novel, always felt very authentic to me. And so did Ava, but I think that there was something very admirable about Josephine specifically because you are writing a character that lived years and years and years ago.
Yeah.
So I imagine on that end, nailing that authenticity for that voice must have been really hard from a craft perspective and just in general. But it's really awesome to hear that, it's inspired by your own family. Yeah, that's awesome. How about you, Maisy?
My book was actually very inspired by my own family too.
I love this.
I came to America when I was 5 years old, so I don't have a lot of direct. I didn't have a lot of memories about my maternal grandmother or my paternal grandparents. I actually didn't know my paternal grandparents at all, and so I think writing the book was a way to kind of think about like all the mysteries, I guess, of them, especially my grandmother. Like the character Vera in the novel is very heavily influenced, by some kind of stories that I heard about my grandmother and, my, brief memories of her. Whenever we would go to Jamaica when I was a kid, she was bedridden. She was always very ill. So I always think of her. I think I do think of her like a ghost. Like she was literally like, I was literally told that she was dying for a period of like 10 years. So, I think that's all I can think about when I think of her. But then as I got older, my mother would like kind of slip in all these strange kind of stories about her. And so the only grandparent that I really had a lot of interaction with was actually my maternal grandfather, who came to America before us and who is the one who brought us over. And I think when I was young, I had a very positive, experience with him. Like I went to his house on all our vacations. I felt like I was as close to him as I can be, I guess, because my family is not very like open or nice to each other, touchy-feely. But yeah, I think as he started to age, he started to do things that were sort of alienating the rest of our family. And I realized that he's kind of this more complicated person than I had originally thought. And so he kind of inspired the character, Abel Paisley, my novel. So the book is kind of just about like, I guess like intergenerational trauma and how, something that I realized when I got older, it's kind of like sometimes the way that my parents behaved when I was younger. It wasn't them. It was like them acting out their parents, and the things that were done to them when they were young too. So yeah, my novel is pretty much just figuring out how ancestry kind of, creates all of us, even though, even if we're completely cut off and have no idea, where we come from, you can still see these like patterns of behavior that emerge, from different people in your family, throughout your life.
Yeah, when I read your novel, so I read your novel during quarantine. And I was wrapping up my work in the classroom, and I just had all this time. So it was one of those weeks where you just there's like you're just kind of like waiting. So I remember reading it, Maisy, and thinking similarly, and just thinking of like my own ancestry and thinking of the things that have been passed down through time, in terms of little things, behaviors, not just like traditions, but also patterns that come from a history or from incidents or things like that. So I did love the fact that it really stayed with me, and that it was like such a strong theme, and just very, very well executed. For whoever has not read this novel, please get to it. It's amazing. And Michael, last but not least.
Yeah, I've thought about it a lot, and I've thought about it a lot since becoming a father too. So I became father of 2 young boys in the middle of sort of the process of revisioning and publication, and then since. And I've been thinking about how like my first literature was the dinner table. The first literature, growing up in Chicago. My dad was from Ecuador, and my mom's family had been in Chicago for 100 years, but they were Lithuanian Jewish, and they were exiles. And I knew my great-grandmother in Chicago. She lived to be in her 90s. And so I would just like fumble around the kitchen around her and ask questions about exile and be that sort of annoying kid, because there was so much going on at the dinner table, whether it was Ecuadorian, whether it was my tío visiting, or whether it was my primos who were living with us various times growing up, and also family friends in Chicago who were from Cuba or the Dominican Republic or Mexico or all over Latin America. And so the dinner table became kind of a type of oral tradition and a first literature. So I would even extend my family, the immediate family stories of exile, outward to the neighborhood I lived in, and to the people who stopped by our home. My dad was very much an open house kind of guy, where if I had friends who were in trouble, they'd come stay with us. If someone down the street needed some food, they'd come with us. So that the dinner table became very much sort of like superficial conversation, but then deep conversations that led into like 2-3 hours of talking about exile. And I didn't realize until much later in my life how those stories of exile, and especially familial exile, played a role in what I was interested in writing, and how, in some sense, the past and the future collide in the present. So when we're writing about people, they both contain a future and they both contain a past, and exploring, particularly with my book, the science fiction possibilities of parallel worlds, but also the very real geography and weight of the past. And this is especially true, I think, when you're biracial. I think this is especially true when you're writing from, literature calls them other voices now, but I never knew there were other voices until I went to college. Right. I was always like, damn, all the voices I grew up with, you're trying to tell me that's other voices? That's like the main story of America as far as I know. And those are the stories that I wanted to contend with as a writer, and try to contend with, whether it was through the oral tradition or whether it was through lineage. But yeah, and I'm trying to, we try to impart things on our kids. My kids are still very young, 3 and 1, but that dinner table, I still call my abuelito, who's 101.
That's incredible.
And I have a very close relationship with him. He was a labor activist. My other grandfather in Chicago's 97, and they're all there, and their memories are deep and profound. And so I still have that relationship with them, and I try to untangle as much as I can of their stories and future projects. The book I'm working on right now is much more closely tied to Ecuador. And so I'm diving further into that, which is scary. I know, Margaret, you did some research, right? A family, I was reading, and it's so hard to find those ghosts and where they fall. But I hope it pans out. Yeah.
That's actually one of the things that I wanted to talk to you guys about, research, but we'll get to that in just one second. I wanted to, well, I think I mentioned this to you, Michael, that your book was very special to me. Like you are, it literally starts describing a Dominican woman, which I was like, oh, me. And I just remember just literally reading the first few lines and being like, oh my God, what is this book? And if I'm not mistaken, the woman is from my town. Yeah, from San Pedro de Macoris. So I was blown away just by the details. And it just speaks to like just how nice it is to read something and just see details that speak to you as a person. And the book does go into way more than just this Dominican woman, but it was such a very strong connection from that very first line that I really loved it.
I'm so glad to hear. My tia is Dominican, so she for whatever reason when I started writing, I thought of my tia's stories of growing up in the Dominican Republic, and she grew up around old sugar plantations, and so yeah,
that's my town. I was like, oh, this is fascinating. Also read it during quarantine, which I had so much time to think about everything. So all three of you, so you are writing about ancestry, which I think it's just like really, in my opinion, I think difficult. And it seems like through your work, you've also kind of like processed your own personal life and your own personal histories. But you kind of alluded to what I wanted to talk about, Michael, research. To write a character like Josephine, for example, Margaret, like, besides your own family history, there's just so much information about life of a woman that was born enslaved. Like, there's all that research. For you, Maisy, there's literally going back into Jamaican history, and also that history that I think that is very detailed in the book. So I imagine that it took more than just a regular textbook to find out. And for you, Michael, your book is just layers of history on history. So I want to talk about research from different perspectives, from a craft perspective and also from a personal perspective. What was that like when you were writing your novels? I feel like I'm in the classroom if I have to call on someone. So anybody answer.
I can talk about it. For the revisioners, I thought I had done a lot of research for my first book, and then I did the revisioners, and I was actually composing the acknowledgments in the back for the books I had referenced, and I was like, oh my gosh, it took me a week just to type all of the books and find all of the books. And I think you said it. I think it's writing from the perspective of a woman in 1924 who had been enslaved and who was living on a farm. Because I felt like in some ways, in a kind of freedom, I was writing about the 40s, but it was in the city of New Orleans, and it was just easier. It was an urban environment, so it was Jim Crow South. It was easier to just pinpoint a lot of the details that were relevant. But for Josephine, I truly had no idea how to run a farm, no idea what she would see when she walked out of her house. I didn't know like what her living arrangements would have been like. What the church would have been like, everything. And then the fact that we also touched on 1855 when she was a little girl and she was enslaved. Figuring out how to detail the escape, especially more than the enslavement itself, but figuring out how to detail that escape was very difficult.
Yeah, I can imagine, but it all just came out so very seamless. So for you, Margaret, I have a question specific to your book. So you wrote about Ava and you wrote about Josephine. And Ava is a woman in the present, and she has a kid, King. I guess my question to you is, which one was harder to write?
Ava
was. That's interesting. Even though I'm assuming you and Ava are closer in age and like.
I think that's what makes it harder. I think that's what makes it harder. I think my husband and I were just talking about this. We talk about it all the time because I've decided I need to just stick to historical fiction at this point. Because whenever I try to get into the present, it just takes so much energy. I think because my own life starts to bleed into the characters if we're a little bit too similar. Like Ava's from New Orleans and we're around the same age. And I just think it's harder to differentiate and to actually like zero in on the voice. I wrote that several times. In the beginning, Ava was supposed to be, she wasn't biracial. She was, Black. She was married to a white man though. And so I was going to have her be married. And in the current book, she's single. But she was married to a white man, and it was her white mother-in-law who was moving into the house. So the Martha character was going to be the mother-in-law. And so that I tried to write that in that way, maybe 5 times. I rewrote it literally 5 times, and I would change little things every now and then. But it just became clear that it wasn't working. And until I really, I think something about making her biracial and making her grandmother white actually made it easier for me to differentiate myself from the character, because I'm married to a white man and I have a white mother-in-law. So it was just really getting tricky. And once I made her biracial, it's like I couldn't identify as much. So it felt like I had to actually inhabit another person. And it facilitated the process because she was no longer so close to me. But Josephine, that was a voice that just came. Like I just channeled her, and I love it when that happens. I think the more that happens, the better. You can tell when you're reading it when that has happened. For authors in general, I think. And I didn't know anything about 1924, but I knew that voice.
Yeah, that voice just felt very natural to me as a reader. And I have another question for you based on that. Do you think that this, I don't want to call it a transference of Josephine, of your grandmother, to the character in itself, do you think there is any sort of magic behind that? In the sense of do you think that there is, I don't want to say spirit or ghost, but maybe. I don't know if I'm in a room where we all believe in this, but sure. Do you think that it was a spiritual?
I'm not sure if it was my great grandmother, but I firmly believe that another body of information, emotions, and feelings comes into me, or I go into it. I don't know how it happens, but I am aware of details and feelings and thoughts that I would just in my own person wouldn't be aware of. I know that that's just what happens. I think, and I'll tell you an example of this, which is so interesting. I always wait to do my research until after I've done a skeleton draft. Maybe it'll be 180 pages. There are no details. Most of it is dialogue, really. But I know the characters in that first draft. And when I go and do the research to make it more, just beef it up and to make it more, appropriate with the timeline, some of that stuff that I've thought was already there. It matches with the details that I learned that I didn't know about. A lot of that stuff will sync up, and I just wouldn't have known that information.
That's incredible. Maisy, so your book has a lot of characters and you move through so many different timelines, and it's really, it's so very well structured. But it's also very unique. And I know that your book starts with a family tree. So there's quite a number of people there. Was there a character that was really hard for you to write?
I think a lot of them were really hard to write at different times. I think the central character, the Abel Paisley character, that was one of the first characters that I had. It was the second chapter is kind of the story about him being a police officer in Jamaica in the 1960s. And the book actually started with that section. Before I knew what I was writing, I had that section of it. And so I think for a long time I thought that was going to be the entire book. And so I spent a lot of time researching a lot about Rastafarianism and Jamaica in the 1960s and the history of violence, political violence. And then I didn't use most of it. So I for some reason that particular story just and that character just took me years and years to write. Because the whole book took me about 12 years to write. But
That's incredible.
A disproportionate amount of it was spent on that one section.
What was challenging? I now understand when someone says that it took them 12 years to write something, and I think that as a reader before, I was like, what do you mean? Like, I remember reading, I think it was A Brief and Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, and reading somewhere that Junot Diaz said that it took him 9 years. And my younger self was like, what do you mean 9 years? It's like an entire lifetime. And I'm like, how? Like, that's impossible. But I understand it now. Now I understand that it can take so long to write something, even if it's like just one story. What was it that, that kept you going those 12 years?
I think once I think I thought that was going to be the whole novel. It was going to be kind of this like coming of age story about that one character. And once I let that go and brought in other characters and kind of decentralized him, it became more, the other sections were a lot more fun to write than that section. That section, I just couldn't. And maybe it was also because it was, I think initially when I started writing it, I was thinking of my father when I was writing it. And for some reason, I just couldn't I couldn't connect. I don't know. It just blocked me from really going anywhere with the character because maybe he was too familiar, as kind of what Margaret was describing. But then the more I wrote other characters and came up with a better kind of premise for the novel, it became a lot easier. And I felt like I feel like I need a certain amount of distance and connection to write. So that really centered that character for me.
That's amazing. What made you said something, you said you let go. And I think that's a really important just concept in life in general. Like, it's hard to let go. What made you let go of what you were pursuing? Like, that coming of age story to then focus on what turned out to be the novel, which is more than just Abel.
I think when I started writing the book, because it is very heavily based on family. So I think I had like a little bit more of an estranged. I don't know why I think I can fix my life with writing. So I was writing about
because we can.
I would use this book to kind of like parse through or think about my relationship with my father. But then I think after a point, me and my father like got a lot closer, so I didn't really need the book anymore. So I just was able to make stuff up, and the more characters I added, I had more fun with them than I ever did that character. So I kind of reimagined that character, and then he became like my grandfather. But it really opened up the world somehow when I shifted focus from one family member to another.
That's really interesting. So, we're all working things out through writing. So writing is a form of therapy. Somebody said that they're watching from I-10. Don't worry, I'm not the one driving. That's amazing. That's good to know. Please be safe. Michael, is writing therapy for you?
Oh, good question. I don't know if it's ever served that purpose for me, but I think what it's helped me do is sort of make sense of being a person who has always grown up sort of in a liminal space. So like I said, I grew up biracial in Chicago. So you have, it's like those Venn diagrams. Like I think in 5th grade, when they taught us Venn diagrams, I was like, oh, I'm the tiny spot in the middle, because we have Lithuanian, Jewish, and Latino. So those, what it means, essentially, what does that mean to sort of be transplanted and be in the United States? And talking about history and research, I really love what everyone's saying. I really loved what you said, Margaret, because I do the exact opposite. I try to fill up my brain with, I read these books, these historical books. I watch documentaries and try to just fill it up. And then in the writing process, similar to you, I don't use any of it. I have like a completely separate file in which I have research, and it's just there like a second brain that I don't use when I'm actually sitting down and writing. But the historical process itself, the novel took 7-8 years to write, and I did get muddled in the history. I did try to figure out how to find myself through it. And there was 2 things that helped me out of it, and they were kind of there all along. And a lot of it had to center around oral tradition. So it wasn't until I went to, a lot of the book does take place in New Orleans, and like I said, New Orleans, I always say New Orleans partitioned my soul when I lived there, when I visited there. I visited so much to research this book. My wife and I just moved there. We've since returned to Chicago, but I think, going to the historical museums and accessing actual papers and going to the Chicago Historical Museum for the sections that take place in the Great Depression in Chicago, and actually sitting down with first-person oral traditions. And I think that's always sort of been a way for me to sort of enter the story. So physically reading something that was written in a diary in 1916 from the Dominican Republic, or in New Orleans during the Great Depression, it was just an enormous avenue for me to sort of like access what history meant. And I think that made sense as a writer, because you have these narratives that have been forgotten or written over, and here they are, vibrant and alive and present. And I distinctly remember sitting on the floor of the Chicago History Museum with papers of an individual who had gone on a boat from Italy to New York, a transatlantic journey that was kind of horrifying. And something clicked as a writer, and I said, I've been spending a lot of time trying to become a historian, but at the end of the day, I'm writing a novel. And so that was something that clicked in my mind, and it allowed me to access those family traditions and sort of the dinner table that I was talking about previously. It took me a long time to make that connection. But it was one that helped me write. It was one that helped me sort of write myself through the novel. So I think for me, if it doesn't serve as personal therapy, to answer your question, but it serves as political therapy. I'm a materialist at heart. I like people who fight, whether that's on paper, whether that's union organizing, whether that's, my wife went on strike a year ago with Chicago Public Schools, and the instant sort of community that happens when thousands of people at once go on strike in a city is one of the most poetic and beautiful things I've ever seen. It's a type of political carnival. And so when I think about history, when I think about putting history in novels, it becomes cathartic, and if not therapy, it helps me see a way forward to the future, because we have centuries of people who are fought. So, and while my book I don't think is overtly political, I think people under political conditions have similar responses throughout history, whether it's the Russian Revolution, whether it's refugees from Latin America, whether it's people facing sort of like death squads in Argentina. People respond in similar ways that enact rebellion, and writing that down, or at least researching it, gives me some of that catharsis for the future.
That's amazing. I don't know if, so you're a little bit in my head, Michael, because my next question is going to be about politics. But before I ask you the next question, Candace, the person who just bombed us. Candace is the owner of Tubby and Coos, which is an incredible bookstore here in New Orleans. So if you are local, and if you're not, I would say just check them out. Tubby and Coos are in Mid-City. Candace is wonderful. They are great. And they were a little worried that they just popped in. So Candace, no worries. We're happy to see you. So politics. So we've talked about ancestry and what that means to you. And I'm curious. Emily says you're giving some poetic context for what I'm going through right now. Thanks. Emily is as you guys know, if you guys know Emily, she's very involved in terms of politics. She has an awesome podcast called Civics, y'all. So follow her. But politics. So I wanted to ask you guys: do you find that the current political climate, do you find it that inspires your work, or does it inspire you in general, or does it hinder you from writing? And we can start with you, Maisy.
I mean, this year was just like a rough year, so I don't know. It's very up and down. I guess I am kind of the novel that I'm working on now, I guess could be considered like more political, because it's about a group of workers trying to organize a strike. But
I want to read it now.
I feel like you guys should be in the same, I don't know if you guys are in writing clubs or anything. We'll get to that later. But if you're not, I feel like there is a thing is happening right now.
But yeah, I think even when I was writing my last book and I went back to, the historical moments that I did choose to highlight were historical moments of rebellion, in Jamaica. So that is like a theme that I'm always interested in, especially like rebellion among Black women. So yeah, I don't know if this climb, it's been, sometimes I'm not really inspired this year, but a lot of times I just haven't been able to produce anything. So it's pretty up and down.
I think I can, I can see how anybody, how about you, Margaret?
Well, let's see. I wrote the Revisioners I think I started in 2017, so the 2016 election had started or had happened. Yeah. Maybe I started writing it in the beginning of 2018, actually. And I was legitimately trying to address something that had happened in 2016. I was trying to address the discrepancy in voting patterns between Black women and white women, and the history of that divide in the country. And I just wanted to show a link between the relationships that Black women and white women have now and the relationships they had, just to kind of give more context for that. It didn't come out of nowhere. There's always been a tendency on one demographic to use the patriarchy to their own benefit. And that's always hurt Black women. I hope with addressing that topic in the book, I hope that it would, you go on these tours, you do these talks, and it would provide a way to facilitate. I don't know, but I hope it would provide a way to facilitate those conversations. And in some ways, it did. I found that it came up a lot on tour and in talks in general. It comes up. I think for this year, because there was just so much negativity and despair, as Maisy said, I think I wanted something more joyful to work on. And so this year I actually wrote my first book where like nothing tragic really happens. There's something a little tragic that happens, but I wouldn't call it tragic. It's just unfortunate, maybe. And I think I just needed it as a retreat, frankly. Like I needed to be able to know, like for a few hours a day, I could go sink into this world where things were, for the most part, fine. And even though it takes place in the 50s and 60s, for the most part, this is a vibrant community that's doing well. And I know that nothing bad's going to happen to them. The funny thing is, I was telling my mom about the plot the other day, and she said, so it's called The Roof, and it's based on Fiddler on the Roof, and it's an adaptation of Fiddler on the Roof. And so there are 3 daughters in this book who ultimately try to marry people that the main character, Vivian, who's the mother, she wouldn't have picked for them. And so the second daughter, she marries this revolutionary guy who ends up taking her to the South to be active in the civil rights movement. And my mom was like, "You're going to kill that character off, aren't you? The Moses character, he's going to die, isn't he?" And I was like, "No, he's not going to die, actually." And she's like, "Really? He's not going to die? None of your characters are going to die?" I was like, "No, he's not going to die." And then I was like, "Well, why? Should he? Would that make it better?" And she's like, no. I was just asking. So it's interesting. I think this is so different for me and so new for me, but I think I needed it because of the political climate and because of the world. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, they muted me in the background. If you guys don't know, there's a whole production system going on for this thing. People are like talking. Margaret, that's incredible. So I really like the premise of this book that you are writing. And also, as you were talking about it, I love Fiddler on the Roof. I think it's just such a fun, I've seen the play. It was just, the music is just so much fun. But also, as you were talking to me, I couldn't help myself from being like, what? You're that far off in your book and you wrote The Revisioners in that little bit of time? What's your secret?
Oh, my mom doesn't think I write books fast enough.
What? What is your mom doing?
She thinks I should have a book out every year. But this one probably won't. I mean, I don't know. I'm still in the process of, it's been submitted to the agent, but I don't know when it'll be published. And I could see it being, 2022. But I don't know. My secret, I do. Two of my kids are old enough to be in school. I have part-time childcare for the other one. I have 3, but I have part-time childcare for the other one. I write 5 pages a day, and it doesn't matter if they're great pages. I just always will write 5 pages a day. I actually used to write more than that, but I realized with revisioners I was rushing. In general, not just with the revisioners, but after the revisioners, I realized, okay, I've been rushing a little bit. I need to calm down. And so I just started doing the 5 pages a day. And it's amazing how after a certain number of days, that just adds up. It feels like unfathomable when you first start on it, that it will go anywhere. And I'm often like, where is this going? Like, on page like 95, I'm like, oh my God, this is never going to go anywhere. It's ridiculous. And then it's amazing how time just passes, and then that's what happens.
You're making me feel really hopeful. So thank you for that.
Oh, good. Because I did. That's what I was going for.
I like to hear it in school because I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. So there's been this year has been very little writing. Oh, and we're home with them a lot for quarantine and
of course.
Like that, so,
oh my goodness. Yeah, absolutely.
That hope is there. I mean, I don't want them to get older, but the time needed to write is
I know.
And so, Michael, the current political climate. Do you feel I'm like tempted to say that there is a fire lit under you? I'm not gonna use the word because I promised myself that I would not curse today.
It's interesting watching this rise of nationalism, watching what is essentially what feels like a fissure in American history, but in a lot of ways is a continuation of American history for millions of us. It's a little bit of deja vu because the stories I grew up with were about Latin American dictators, often backed by the CIA. Like these mechanisms and the way, just to be blunt, the way our federal government and the way our president is behaving is very similar to sort of Latin American leaders who United States installed in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And so this sort of fissure in American politics is what a good friend of mine who's an organizer, she's a Syrian and her family are refugees from Iraq, which she calls empire coming home. So we've had a century of American empire. We've had this century of invading other people, installing other leaders. Not to get too political, but let's get too political. And then, so what we have is this fissure in history, and then we have sort of the American political system just sort of not only reflecting our hundreds and hundreds of years of history of people who are very similar to the administration now, but also sort of this is empire coming home. All those methods of oppression that we learned abroad are coming home. The militarization of police, the absolute abject rule of the 1%. This is what we perfected abroad, and it's coming home. And so thinking about how that, I think that is what I was thinking about with the first book before Trump. I was teaching high school for 10 years in the process of writing this novel. I was teaching students in Chicago who dropped out and came back. And one of the most heartbreaking things was when my students were hiding from ICE due to the previous administrations, starting with Bush and working through all 3 presidents, sort of the assault on young brown, Latino, Afro-Caribbean kids who were in my classroom, and they had family hiding from ICE. It broke a lot of hearts, whether it's Republican or Democrat, hearts are being broken. And that fire is not going to go away with me. And I think that's something that's instilled in as an educator and for surely as a writer. The novel I am hoping to continue working on right now slowly does take place in the future. It's about an Ecuadorian young adult who's in a black site in Chicago in the future after some sort of rebellion. But it's important to me that he's apolitical. It's very important to me that he's interested in history. And I'm interested in how we have these recursive events in history and writing from the perspective of someone who's living through a very tumultuous time in the future, but who is obsessed with history going back hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so what interests me too is, again, like I said previously, I think how the future and the past collide in the present. And so it's very much of this current political move, you know, in the movement against what we're seeing is very much with me. And I started out as a teacher, started out growing up with people who are now union organizers. I don't know how to let that away into another slipstream when I sit down and write. That being said, it's an important time to let it breathe for me as a writer, and to see where the historical connections take place. I'm writing very slowly this year in particular. Like I said, I have a 3-year-old and 1-year-old at home. But I'm also really believe in the experiential process. And I think, you know, being a new father has taught me to take my writing in different directions too.
So sorry, the production team backstage, which is what I'm gonna call them now, they keep on telling me that there's a weird echo, so they mute and unmute me, just to let you all know. If you guys can, I guess you can see the private chat. Maisy, are you working on something new, or are you enjoying the spoils of your novel? Really rooting for you.
No, I'm actually under contract for another book, so I am trying to learn how to write faster. Yeah, so hopefully it'll be finished or I'll have a full draft by January. But it's
That's amazing.
Hopefully, I don't know.
Because it just came out.
Huh? Oh,
It just came out.
Yeah. I've been trying to write this book all year, the new book, and it's, you know, I've started over a lot of times, and I just but I do think I write better when I have a lot of pressure. So I'm giving myself that arbitrary deadline. But it's about it's set in Florida, and it's set in a wealthy retirement community, and it's about a group of immigrant home health aides trying to organize a strike.
Okay. That makes sense.
That's awesome. I feel like all of your books have really strong connections to place, sense of place in general. And I think that I personally love and prefer writing that, you know, sure, there's plot, but also if I can have a very strong sense of place in what I'm reading, I'm just fascinated by that. I'm just curious, does anyone share the same feelings, the same love for sense of place?
Yeah, absolutely. I think oftentimes a lot of my work, even in short stories or nonfiction, definitely starts with place. I think because to root yourself when you're first generation is probably an instinct, whether you like it or not. I also have itchy boots where, you know, I spent so much of my 20s and early 30s traveling. I taught high school, good union job, get your summers off, and I would just take off. I remember one morning when I was 25, because I started teaching at 22, I called my mom and I asked her to just take me to, you know, if she could drive me to O'Hare. And she's like, "What are you doing now?" And I was like, "Well, I was real bored last night, and there was this cheap thing going on, so I bought a ticket to Thailand. So can you please take me?" So I did that through my 20s. I was often traveling as much as I could, and also going to see family in Ecuador as much as I could to visit with my abuelito, my grandfather. And so that sort of wandering sort of mentality when I was young, I think when I sit down to write, I think affects me, where I can't sit still. You know, my wife always says I'm really bad at kitchen scenes. I need to get better because I physically can't sit still even on the page. And that can be a problem, obviously. But I think it sort of gives me the propulsion to sort of write and to think about places. I don't want to say as a character, but I want to think place as sort of this macro, you know, this omniscience all to its own that offers so much to a novel or to characters.
Sorry, I had to go and unmute myself because of what production team said. So Margaret, you talked about your mom, which by the way, I just find is fascinating and hilarious. And I kind of want to meet her now. Who thinks that you write slow and expecting a book every year.
She thinks there should be a book every year. She'll say stuff like James Patterson has a book out every year.
That's hilarious.
You're
Maisy, how about you? Do you is there a figure in your life who's hurry up? Besides your own arbitrary deadline, is there a family member who's like, what are you doing? How long does it take?
No, I think my parents don't really, they don't really know anything about my writing so much. I think only recently did they really come to, when the book came out, they realized I was writing fiction. I don't think they knew that before. So there's not really like a lot of pressure from them. I think my boyfriend gives me a lot of pressure because he can see me like procrastinating because we don't have kids. Like, you know, I theoretically could be writing more than I am. So sometimes he's like, you know, why is this taking so long? But yeah, I think that's the only place I kind of have real pressure from.
That's pretty cool. I think it's good to have somebody.
Yeah.
So Megan, Dr. Holt just said, fun fact, James Patterson is the #1 most requested author in adult prisons, which is really interesting. Which brings me to Dr. Holt is also the executive director of One Book, One New Orleans, which is always doing really awesome efforts to bring literacy to everyone. So check them out and support my people. So I love that, you know, that you guys have those people who are basically asking you questions and I guess pressuring you somehow. How about you, Michael? I don't think you told us.
Where the pressure comes from?
Yeah. Who's like, hurry up?
My wife's she's a visual artist, so she teaches 5th through 8th grade, but she has her master's in art history, and so she gives context. You know, she could also soothes me when I think I'm going too slow, but is also very much like you should move on some ideas. I'm very distractible. I came to writing prose a little bit late. I worked writing for the stage, which when you write for the stage, you have very immediate deadlines, and you have other people who call you all the time to tell you to get on it because you have rehearsals and things like. So I became very accustomed to sort of like producing things very quickly when I was writing first for the stage before prose. And now that I don't have that, a lot of it is, I think my wife's really wonderful, and she gives context to how quickly or how slowly certain things need to be written. And it depends on the idea. So I do write some creative nonfiction as well, and those pieces tend to go a lot quicker for whatever reason. Usually I'll have the idea, and it is my wife who says, you need to write that this week, and that's how it is. I'm like, okay. But with novels, I think the process has been slower, but she gives it context, and that's there's a grace to having the context of how work is produced. And I have a great agent who is always usually, you know, I feel very grateful because he's asking me how things are going as opposed to the other way around, like me bothering him. He always checks in with me, which I really appreciate.
That's really awesome. Do you guys rely on other support systems? Are you guys in like a club? Do you have specific people who read your work, buddies, whatever you call it? Margaret, tell us, do you have besides your awesome mom?
Well, you know, it's funny. My mom actually doesn't do the feedback, but it was her idea to do the roof based on Fiddler on the Roof. She came up with the title, and her idea was quite different. Her idea was to have it set in New Orleans during Katrina, and like the pivotal scene at the end when they're being displaced, it would have been like people standing on the roof trying to get aid, and of course they'd be displaced from their homes because of the storm. So she has these brilliant ideas, but no, I have a writing group as well. I have 2 writing groups. So I have one that's like a group of moms. There are 3 of us, and they give really, really good feedback, and it's really cool because we can go, because there are only 3 of us, we each can submit every time we meet, and it takes about 3 hours, but it's really nice. I have another writing group in San Francisco, and we're doing Zoom now. There are maybe like 10 of us, and maybe I get like 2 or 3 turns to go a year because there are so many relatively. But it's hard when you're writing novels. I think it's hard to get it workshopped. In the group of 3, I will like have them read a whole novel, and we do that for each other. With the bigger group, like the other day, I gave them 27 pages. It happened to luckily just be one character's whole section in entirety. And so they were able to kind of read it discreetly without having too much other information. And that was extremely helpful. So yeah, it's nice. And what I love about both of the groups is that no one is competitive. Everyone is at different levels, and everyone is publishing at different rates to different levels of acclaim and different levels of exposure. but everybody is so supportive of each other, and it feels really genuine.
That's really awesome. I as someone who's starting out, I think that without a support group sounds like a tragedy, like writing is but without a support system, without a support system, it's just really hard. How about you, Maisy? Do you have a system? A support group system?
When I was writing the Ghost, I did have a writing group that was that I had joined right after I finished grad school, and we met for most of the time. And then in the last like 2 years, it's kind of broken up. Like people have moved and started families and don't have as much time. But I do have like I always make my boyfriend read whatever I write, whether he wants to read it or not. And then I have a friend, a former roommate who's also a writer, who I can always kind of count on to read. And at times, like if I feel like I need more feedback, I'll usually take like a non-credit workshop at like Catapult or Sackett Street. I've taken Sackett Street workshop classes too.
That's
incredible. That I love that, by the way, because you do have an MFA, you do have an awesome nomination for your first novel, but I think it speaks really highly of you to be a person who's still pursuing learning through other avenues. So that's awesome. That makes you super cool. Let's talk about legacy. So we talked about ancestry and how those things have impacted you personally and how they have informed your work. What do you hope for your legacy to be?
Big question.
Should I call on somebody? Tell us, Michael.
That's so hard. I would like to have, for me, I would like to just keep pushing and just try to write a few more books and to have, we have a legacy coming right now. That's it. Hi, Rafi.
Hi.
I think for me, I'm always trying to just keep sense of the next book, the eye of what the next book might be. And for me, I think the thread of any vision I have right now entails 3 books I want to write as a type of trilogy about exile. So for me, that's kind of what I would like to explore. This book primarily was in the past. The next one will be primarily in the future, but exploring 3 books on exile. If I could finish that, I would just be extraordinarily happy. So 2 books seems reasonable, but it's still, if I can do it, I'd be quite happy.
That's ambitious and awesome. Maisy, what about your legacy, whether it's personal or professional? What do you hope to leave behind?
I think Margaret said this earlier, that you are more into the historical fiction. I feel like that's kind of what I realized with after I finished writing this book, that that's probably more the path that I want to go down. I really just want to finish the second book, but I have like, I think about 4 other books that I want to write. But it just feels like this is kind of like a hurdle that I have to jump over before I know whether I have like a real career or if it was just like a one-off. But yeah, I do want to keep writing specifically about that theme of, like rebellion and among women of color, specifically Black women mostly. And I still want to, I feel like there's still so much to explore about Jamaican history in fiction. So I think I want to continue kind of to leave behind books that explore specific periods in Jamaican history.
Do you go back to Jamaica often? Do you visit often?
I was like kind of on a roll before COVID, and actually my family is like kind of pressuring me to go down next month, but I don't think I'm going to go. But hopefully I'll end up, once things go back to normal, I'll continue to go every year.
How about you, Margaret? What do you hope your legacy to be?
I think I intend for it to be books that explore relationships between white people and Black people, and at some point I do want to have them be more and more instructive. It would be a subtle thing, though. I mean, of course, it's fiction, But I think I do want to start making statements. I always have made statements, but I think I want the statements to be more productive than they've been as I get older as a writer. I think in the beginning, like with A Kind of Freedom, I think the statement was basically like, as far as we've come, in some ways we've gone backwards with race relations. I think with the Revisioners, I, of course, as I said, I wanted to examine the relationships between white women and black women and the history of that, and sort of make a statement that where we are right now is not a surprise. But I think as I go on, I think I want to be more instructive and productive about those statements that I'm making about race relations. Like, I want the work to actually almost be like a movement of sorts, and like in a positive direction. Like, I think in a lot of ways I've been really motivated by anger and resentment, and I've been really focused on the problems. And of course, there still are problems, and I still want to focus on them. But I think I want my work to just take more of a focus on solutions, on more positive, more loving, more healing solutions between the races.
That's incredible. I have no doubt that we're going to be reading all three of you for a long time to come. Maybe all four of us. So we have to wrap up soon, but before we go, I just want to show people your wonderful books. Please go buy them because they're wonderful, and check out Tubby and Coos if you're here. So Maisy, wait, I never get this camera thing right. So Maisy, you're the only person that has not signed my book. So when I go home to see my parents, somehow we're gonna have to make this happen.
Yeah. Are they still in Newark, or?
Yes, they are. They're in the Ironbound. So before we go, the last thing that I want you guys to tell us is one piece of craft advice for writers.
I have some craft advice, but I'm gonna plug my computer in for a minute. 1 second.
Okay.
I would say one of the things that helped me in writing is to really understand structures of novels from other heritages and countries. I grew up with a lot of Latin American literature, but reading in Spanish and also reading in translation to understand that Spanish language novels have very different structures. It really freed me from the way that I started as a young writer. I'm really into Eastern European novelists, Latin American novelists. The more I read of works in translation, the freer I feel sitting down. And primarily that has to do with language and the ways in which structures change and are altered based on long-standing traditions that carry through other parts of the world.
What about you, Maisy? One quick piece of craft advice.
I would say it's always helpful I found it helpful to know much more about each character than what I'm putting on the page. So even though I feel like I over-researched the last book, I think by the time I was done, I just knew so much about every character in every place that, that's what made them feel real to me.
Amazing. And Margaret.
Yeah, I would say it's important for me to find out what the voice is before I start writing. Sometimes I'll get caught up in the storyline or the themes, and I'll start writing, and I haven't really locked in a really sturdy sense of who the character is. And to me, it has to be a visceral sense. Like, it can't be what I just logically know about the character. It has to be like I really can feel that character, like a friend or something where you can predict their behavior because you know them so well. And I think if I had always taken that approach before writing, I would have saved so much time.
Oh, that's incredible. I'm going to take that and write it down. And when I go do my homework after turning a story on Monday, everything that you just said to me, I'm going to be like repeating it back, saying it back to myself. Thank you so much, guys, for agreeing to do this, for writing the wonderful books that you wrote. They are, they stay with me, and they will for a long time. And I can't wait until, I get to reread them and I get to read your new things. Thank you so much. I, from the bottom of my heart, really appreciate all three of you. Megan.
Thank you.
Hi. This is intentional. I'm not bombing. I'm just coming on to say thank you and tell everybody what's next. So thank you guys so much. That was incredible. Once again, another one I'm going to be watching over and over and over again. And Annell, thank you so much, especially for that shout out to One Book One New Orleans. As you guys know, we are doing these 4 days of literature, music, photography, and more so that we can support the year-round work that One Book One New Orleans does to provide literacy resources to adults who are enrolled in adult education programs, adults who are enrolled in ESL programs, incarcerated adults, and incarcerated teens. We get books to all of these folks free of charge, along with a curriculum that we design. We also get the book into the ears of the blind and print handicapped through the WRBH Reading Radio. We are also, during the pandemic, really working with some community partners to get books where they're needed most. So during this pandemic, I said it last time, we'll say it again, we've given out 2,300 books and counting to primarily low-income children and incarcerated teens and adults. So 4 days to serve this community better, and you get to kick back and enjoy it all on a donation basis because COVID has hit our wallet, so give what you can. You can do that by clicking those links in the comments section, and even if you're watching later, the links are live even when we are not. You can also do that by texting WAM20 WAM20 to 44321, or by going on your PayPal and typing in wordsandmusicnola@gmail.com. Whether it is $1 or $1,000, we will take it and we will be so grateful. Thank you so much. We are coming back in 9 minutes with the modern memoir. Bobby Fiedler is the moderator, and he'll be joined by Beth Ann Fennelly. He'll be joined by Morris Ardoin. He'll be joined by Teresa Stovall. And last but not least, 2019 National Book Award winner, Sarah Broom. Thank you so much. We'll see you in 9 minutes. Bye.